Hey all, and welcome to Caboose Divergent Discussions. I'm Tina, and I also have lived experience with autism and ADHD through people in my life. So I'm really excited to be having this conversation with Kate today. And before we get started, just a quick note that this session is being recorded and will be uploaded onto YouTube. We'll also have time at the end for any audience questions, so feel free to drop any questions in the chat. And without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce our guest today, Kate. So,
Thank you so
Kate,
much.
all good. So Kate is a neuroinclusion consultant who helps managers build neuroinclusive cultures. Her journey started 4 years ago when her children were diagnosed with autism and ADHD. And her advice? Go away and become the expert. So she did. So what she discovered is that different neurotypes bring untapped skills, fresh thinking, and innovative ways of solving problems, most of which goes to waste in organizations that aren't really set up to use them. So that's a problem Kate helps companies solve and will be helping us today to learn more about. So welcome again, Kate, and really looking forward to picking your brain and learning more about this.
Yeah, thank you so much for that nice, warm welcome. I'm really excited to be here and to, get stuck into the conversation. It's such an important area that we need to focus on. And we all know it's been in the news lately for all the right reasons and all the wrong reasons. So, yeah, it's very topical.
Indeed it is. And with that, let's just jump straight in then, Kate. So what does neuroinclusive workplace mean?
Yeah. So it's a good question. A neuro-inclusive workplace starts with neuro-inclusive approach to management and leadership. So I always start with the managers. That's the piece that I believe is the biggest shift, is going to create the biggest shift. If you work with the leaders, the managers, the supervisors, the team leaders, those people who manage groups of people, they're the ones who can make the biggest difference to individuals' everyday working experience from, the day, the time they step into the office or they switch on their computer to the time they log off or leave the office. And they're the ones that can make the biggest impact. So it all starts with the managers. It all starts with their ability to be able to understand and react to how neurodivergence shows up in the workplace. If they create a culture, they create values, they create behaviors, they create expectations around neurodivergence being part and parcel of a working environment, then that's the first rung on the ladder of neuroinclusion and creating a neuroinclusive workplace.
Mhm. And when you talk about culture and values and creating that, so say if you're a manager that's new or wanting to learn more about this, where do you even start? Because culture and values, it seems like a very important topic, but also seems like a very big topic as well.
Yeah, it just starts with behaviors and how you interact with your stakeholders, with your colleagues, with your team members. It sounds big, you're right. Culture, what's culture? It's bigger than me, it's bigger than my team, it's bigger than my department. But actually, it starts with you. It starts with your team, it starts with your department. It's all to do with how you interact, how you show up, how you build trust, psychological trust, relationship building, how comfortable everyone feels with everyone else. And that's the starting point for neuro inclusion. And it all starts with the manager. And that's why I say building that relationship between managers and their teams is the starting point. So the culture, sounds big, but actually there are so many different subcultures within organizations. You have the overall organizational culture, which is big and huge and difficult to shift, difficult to change. But then you have subcultures, lots of tiny little subcultures within teams, within departments, within business units. And they sometimes operate independently. So even if your organization is not particularly aware of neurodivergence, doesn't have neuro inclusion on the radar, you as a manager, you as your team leader can create that culture of neuro inclusion. It doesn't have to depend on the organization and the leaders above you. You can start doing it yourself just by the way that you interact, the way you present. And remember that a lot of managers are also neurodivergent themselves. They may not be disclosed, they may not know themselves, but they could well be neurodivergent. And we have to be mindful of that too.
Hmm. So it sounds like what you're saying is we, the managers, have control not of the overall culture of the organization, but of that micro ecosystem, which is their team, and the change starts with them. So
Exactly.
how does a manager even begin to create that psychological safety without overcomplicating things?
I think the starting point has to be awareness of different ways of working. Everyone has unique ways of working. Everyone's brain is wired differently. We live in a neurodiverse society. So there's a difference between neurodiversity and neurodivergence, and people often conflate them. But every single room with no matter who's in it is neurodiverse, regardless of whether they're neurodivergent or not. And all neurodiversity means is that we think differently, we learn differently, we behave differently depending on our culture, depending on our upbringing, depending on our gender. There are so many different inputs to how we show up as human beings. But neurodivergent people, their brains are wired differently. So autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, our brains are wired differently to neurotypical people. And all that means neurotypical is people who are not neurodivergent, who don't have those neurotypes like ADHD, like autism. So when you think about ADHD and autism, dyspraxia, dyslexia, they are different ways of interacting with the world, different ways of interacting with other people. And if a manager can understand that as a starting point, if they go into a leadership role, a management role, thinking everyone is different, my team is going to be different, I'm going to have neurodivergent people. They may not tell me they're neurodivergent, but there could well be neurodivergent people in my team. Then that's a great starting point. It doesn't have to be complicated. It can just be that, my team is neurodiverse, number one. That's a starting point, and my team could also be neurodivergent. So the way that I lead and I manage has to be neuroinclusive in order to encourage everyone to do their best work and to thrive. You can't go into a leadership role or a management role thinking everyone's going to be the same, everyone's going to think the same, everyone's going to behave the same, and because you will be disappointed. So yeah, if you're looking at it from a practical standpoint, that's the starting point.
Mhm. And being aware and being able to, as you said, just go into it knowing that there are going to be different thinking styles, different strengths, different challenges as well. And if, say, a manager were to go to work tomorrow, how do they even begin to, I guess, gain that awareness? So do they read books about it? How do they, you don't know what you don't know, so how do you actually learn about the different thinking styles and different ways of going about things from all their teammates?
Yeah, well, it's a difficult thing to do. And this is where I come in. That's why I'm so passionate about what I do, because I train and I coach managers. I also coach neurodivergent professionals as well to be able to navigate working environments because they are so complicated and they can be quite political, and so complex to, move around and to achieve your objectives. But the first thing that a manager needs to do is just understand that, everyone is different, and that if you are working with a wide range of people, you are going to experience different behaviors, different neurotypes, neurodivergence will come into play, and it's going to be unfamiliar. Is that I use that word a lot because people rely on familiarity to get by in their working life, in their social life, in everything they do. They rely on memory and familiarity. So I recognize that behavior. I've seen it before. I have experience of that. I know what to do. And with neurodivergence, you just often don't have that. So if you don't know anything about neurodivergence, you will probably be surprised in some instances by what you see. And so that's why I love what I do, because I give people that foundational understanding of what to expect with that unfamiliarity and how to deal with it. But there are podcasts, there are books, as you say, there are a multitude of resources out there, academic articles, very basic articles where people can learn a lot about neurodivergence and how it shows up. And if you're a manager, leading a team, you need to be curious anyway. Curiosity should be part of your makeup. And if you're not curious, then you have to wonder why you're leading a team. Why do you want to manage people if you can't deal with difference? That would be the question I would ask someone who was unwilling to do that work.
Mhm. Curiosity is so important, isn't it? And
Mm.
on that note, when it comes to just what organizations or managers tend to do wrong, what are the top mistakes that you see?
Gosh, where do I start? The first thing that I see more often than not is an unwillingness to accept that neurodivergence could be present. So the automatic assumption is that something is wrong, someone has a problem, someone has a challenge, they don't know how to do their job, or they're lazy, or they're incompetent, or they're disorganized, or they're always late. Those are the things I see happen time and time again. And whenever you present them with an alternative to punitive action, which is usually let's show this employee that this is not the way they're supposed to behave. We have to demonstrate as an example that if they don't behave in this typical way or this expected way, there'll be consequences. And it's just so time consuming, it's expensive, it's resource heavy. I'm talking about performance improvement plans, PIPs, as we call them. They are so often used when neurodivergence is present, and it is so detrimental to the organization, to the team, to the colleagues, and to the individual as well as the manager. And all they have to do is think differently. So there's this knee-jerk reaction that managers take to certain behaviors on familiarity. That's why I mentioned on familiarity. They can't cope with it. So they start thinking, I have to do something. This person needs to be corrected. And it all goes wrong and downhill from there. Whereas all they need to think is perhaps there's something else at play, neurodivergence, different neurotype, different way of thinking, different way of doing. How can I support this person? How can I work with this person? How can I help this person to do good work? Everyone wants to do good work. And there are many neurodivergent people in the workplace who are excellent at what they do, but the way they do it is perhaps a bit different.
And what is coming up is just the curious part where you're not just stopping at, okay, this person is late, this person doesn't do their work. It's being curious about the why behind it as well, the unfamiliar part. And say if there is a situation where currently a manager is listening to us talk right now and they're thinking, okay, I have one employee who's constantly late. I've had chats with them and meetings with them, but it's still not changing. What's one thing that they can do the next time to better support this person? So they've already become aware that this person might, be neurodivergent. What would be the next thing they can do?
Have a conversation with that person. I read an article, I posted it actually on LinkedIn today, and it was this guru or a HR consultant, and she wrote in a tabloid newspaper in the UK called The Mirror. It's a very simplistic newspaper where they tend to use sensational headlines in order to get people, to read the articles. And the headline was, I'm a HR professional. These are the three things that will get you fired. And those three things that she listed, one of them was punctuality or lack of punctuality. And all of them are very often aligned with neurodivergence. So if you're a manager and your team member comes in late continuously, why not have a conversation about that? Why jump to conclusions? Why does it have to be they can't get up on time? They can't set their alarm. They can't be bothered to get up. They can't get to the office on time. They're disorganized. They're incompetent. They're lazy, etc. They're poor timekeepers. Why can't it be rush hour is stressful? I struggle with rush hour, commuters, first thing in the morning. It's a nightmare on the trains, on the buses, on the roads. Why not think to yourself, perhaps that person cannot cope with the noise, with the smell, with the feel of other people close to them. Have you thought about that? Have you thought about a different working pattern? Is it necessary for them to be in at that time, specific time every day? Could you be flexible? Could they come in later and leave later to avoid that commuter crush? Have you had a conversation with them? Have you found out what their circumstances are? How they get into work, what they feel about the journey into work? And again, it all comes down to curiosity, having that conversation one to one with that individual, finding out more about what it is that they are experiencing on the way to work that perhaps is causing them to be late, and not jumping to conclusions about negative reasons.
Mhm. Amazing. And when it comes to that communication as well, what it sounds like is firstly just putting yourself in their shoes and understanding their world a bit better as well and using that curiosity. And what about the actual communication? When you communicate with them, is it better to be just very direct and set your expectations? How does it work in terms of the manager maybe opening up that channel, and what would be good practice when it comes to that?
Yeah, I mean, it all depends on the culture of the organization. I've worked with organizations that are very flat, very collaborative, very peer to peer. And in those instances, you can have a relaxed conversation. But if it's quite top down, quite hierarchical, quite, instructive from the top to the bottom, then it's harder to have a sort of a informal conversation. And it all depends on the manager's relationship with the individual too, regardless of the culture. I go back to what I said earlier in our conversation about creating your own culture, your own team culture, regardless of what's happening around you, what's happening above you. So saying to yourself, I know our culture is top down. I know our culture is very leadership driven and very directive, but I'm going to create a subculture or a team culture which is more collaborative, which is more peer to peer, which is more informal. And then you can have a basic person to person, human to human conversation, regardless of any, formal structures. You are the person's manager in the workplace, but when you leave, you're just two, regular human beings. And I always think of, I've led a lot of teams, and I've always worked in a very collaborative way with my team members. Sometimes I've been accused of being too relaxed, too informal, but I feel that that's the best way you can get what you need from individuals, what you need from your team members is by, approaching them as, human to human rather than manager to employee. You have that, one-to-one conversation with respect. And of course, if they haven't disclosed or you haven't got, any kind of formal indication of neurodivergence, then you have to tread carefully, because they may not want to have that conversation. So, you can start with, what's happening on the way to work, and go from there, in a very relaxed and informal way. Grab a cup of tea or coffee. It doesn't have to be in a meeting room, in the office, you could go for a walk. Those are the best conversations that I've had with team members over the years is out of the office, not in a stuffy meeting room, where everything feels constrained.
Mhm. My favorite are walking meetings where you get to go
Oh, I
and
love
just
them.
explore.
I love
Me
them.
too.
My ADHD loves movement, so
It's great, isn't it? And
yeah.
so what it sounds like is you're talking and connecting with the human in front of you and just being able to understand them and their perspective more as well. And when it comes to inclusion efforts, say, when have you seen it fail? Because we're talking about things that can work, but when has it failed in a real day-to-day situation?
It usually fails when people assume things, and that's why I say that you have to tread very carefully. So if you go around thinking that you know what people are experiencing or neurotype they have, I've seen that happen where people have said, "Oh, you're autistic. I know you're autistic." Well, none of us are. Well, at least, most people are not psychiatrists. They cannot diagnose neurodivergence. The only person who can do that is a qualified doctor. So you have no business giving people labels. If you don't know, then you don't know. If they haven't produced a formal diagnosis certificate for you to look at, then you have got no business assigning them a condition that you have no idea whether they have or not. That's usually the first mistake that I've seen. It's arrogance and assumptions around thinking that they know, and then therefore making lots of decisions about it based on what they think they know about that neurotype. And of course, you will know much more than others that you've met one neurodivergent person. There's a very famous saying, you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. And of course, there are commonalities. You can see from one person to the next themes, but that's the same for all human beings. But, one autistic person, you meet is very different to the next person you meet, and it's a spectrum. So there's no way that you can assume what people need. You have to have the conversation. And I've spoken to a lot of neurodivergent professionals who don't know what they need in order to do their best work. So it needs to be a collaborative effort, not one person doing all the running, one person doing all the research, one person doing all the organization and setup. It has to be a collaborative effort. It's not fair for a manager to have to think, do, coordinate around a team member's neurotype if they're saying, well, I don't know what I need, give me what I need. It has to be a collaborative effort. And that's where I've seen it work best. Where I've seen it work worst is when there's assumptions and people just think they know everything. It's a disaster.
It sounds like a disaster. So,
It is, yeah. Usually is.
yeah. And to prevent such disasters from happening, if a manager perhaps suspects that one of their employees might have neurodivergence, how do you even, because you wouldn't directly ask them, but say if they want to know so they can better support them, what's one thing that they can say or ask to be able to open that channel while still respecting the other person if they don't want to really talk about it or don't
Yeah,
even
I mean,
know?
you don't have to. Yeah, it's a good question. You don't have to rely on diagnosis or neurotype, being definite and defined. As I said earlier, we're all neurodiverse. And if there's a suspicion that there's neurodivergence, you don't have to focus on that. You have to play clever, when you're having these conversations. Some people are not aware. Some people are aware and don't want to be aware. They don't want to face up to the fact that they're neurodivergent. Some people are diagnosed and don't disclose. You've got a whole mix of people, in working environments who have different states of mind around neurodivergence. And it goes from one end of the scale to the other. So you have to really tread carefully. I would never advocate someone, coming out and saying, are you, because that's really unfair. The only way you can have that understanding and knowledge is if the person presents it to you. But you can still have the conversation about difference. You can still have the conversation about diversity. You can still have the conversation about unfamiliar behaviors and traits and ways of working. So, it doesn't need to be a definitive discussion about autism or ADHD. It can be a discussion about, style, and preference, that kind of thing. I've met a lot of neurodivergent professionals. I know they're autistic because of my experience and my lived experience of autism, but and I can see it's, not, I'm 99.9% certain that they are, but I can't tell them that they are, and they probably don't know they are. So what we do is we talk about differences. We have role play, we have scripts that we work from. We have this unspoken conversation about neurodivergence without mentioning neurodivergence. It's quite interesting. It's like the elephant in the room, that no one wants to talk about. And really, you need permission to have that conversation. If they don't give you the permission, then you need to dance around it. It's difficult. I'm not saying it's easy, but it can be done. You can be clever about it and have a conversation about differences because at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. It's always preference. It's always difference. It's always, unique ways of doing things, different ways of doing things, unfamiliar ways of doing things. I've met a lot of team members, within organizations who are clearly, neurodivergent, but will never say that they are, but will have an understanding that they will sit in a particular chair every single day. They will have a particular time that they eat lunch, and in a particular spot where they'll eat lunch, they will be permitted to go into a room and work quietly when other people are perhaps working collaboratively. There are lots of allowances that are created for these individuals, but without mentioning autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia.
And when you talk about, instead of it being, say, a label and focusing purely on the label, we're focusing on, say, their preferences and styles. And everyone, as you said at the beginning, is diverse and unique as well. So I really like how we're trying to find ways to just support them more in that aspect. And when you talk about role play, can you give an example? How does a manager, or how could a manager incorporate role play into helping their employees?
Yeah, so many autistic people, and particularly in working environments, can struggle with communication, particularly in organizations. So if you're, outside with your friends in a social environment, it's different because everyone communicates in their own way and it's very relaxed and free. But in organizations, in corporate settings in particular, there are expectations around behavior. There are expectations around verbal communication, non-verbal communication, the way that you move, the way that you interact with others, stakeholder management. And so what I often do is I'll build scripts around scenarios that might happen for that autistic person to be able to practice what good looks like, or I shouldn't say what good looks like, what neurotypical looks like in order to fit, into the mold. At the end of the day, neurodivergent people are in the minority. It's between 15 and 20% is the current estimate, although they think it's more. So, 75%, 80% of people are 85% of people are neurotypical. They're not neurodivergent. And so the way the world works is designed for them. So what I help autistic people to do often is to interact, to communicate, particularly verbally, in a way that helps them to fit in to organizational culture.
Mhm. And I can see from that you said that you needed permission first before you can do this sort of thing as well. So
Yeah.
how does asking for permission look like? Well, firstly, I'm guessing you have to build that trust to begin
Yes.
with. And then because I'm imagining the jump from, okay, let's work on this together. And hey, do you want to role play? But also going from that to role play, I can imagine some people feeling a bit disrespected or patronized as well. What would be a good way to transition smoothly into, say, something like that?
Yeah, so it's a good point, and you're right. Some people would feel patronized, and I'm not saying in any way that everybody needs this, but some people do. And the reason why I have done that is always because I've been asked to. I've never come in and said, "Oh, let's do role play. Let me draw up some scripts for you." No, 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 no. I have been asked to do that because these individuals are autistic and they have a type of autism. Their autism presents in a way that makes it difficult for them to communicate in a neurotypical fashion. So they are often perceived as blunt. They're often perceived as harsh. They're often perceived as rude. They're often perceived as abrupt. And they don't understand why. So they will come to me and they will say, Kate, people keep telling me I'm too sharp and I don't understand what they mean. I speak in a way that I believe, is helpful. I tell people what they need to hear when they need to hear it. And so it's that kind of conversation that we have that leads to those, creation of scripts and scenarios and role play because they ask me to demonstrate what it is that those stakeholders are asking them to do because they don't understand. It doesn't come naturally to some autistic people, that style of communication.
Hmm. So it sounds like an organic growth where they come to you and they go, "Why am I struggling?" And then from there, it naturally flows into role play or other things that work for them and their preferences as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I can see it for myself, but I go by spirit. So I feel people's spirits. I'm a kind of an empath. A lot of neurodivergent people are empaths. And so I go by people's spirits and I don't tend to get offended. If I know the person doesn't mean to be rude or abrupt or to sound harsh, I don't take it personally. But for many people, particularly in organizations, they're not empaths and they only see what they want to see and they only hear what they want to hear. So if they think they're being rude, then they are rude and then it escalates from there. Yeah, it's really hard.
Hmm. Yeah, I can imagine. And when it comes to, because we're talking about supporting the teammates and supporting everyone as well, how do we shift from accommodating them to actually designing inclusive systems for them?
Ah, that's the $1 million question. And I think that's where organizations are starting to move towards now, this collaborative co-creation style of working where everyone has a say in how things work. And I tell you where it's happening more and more is AI. So I'm involved in a lot of forums where AI creation is a hot topic. It's obviously already happening. We've got tools that everyone knows about, like ChatGPT, like Copilot, like Claude. And of course, we can't roll those back. But what we can do is help them to learn. And I don't know how many of those platforms were built by neurodivergent people, probably a lot, because there are many neurodivergent people in tech, in very high level tech. There's a lot of neurodivergent people and they're drawn to those professions. But what neurodivergent people are we talking about? We're probably talking about white, autistic males of a certain age, of a certain background, a certain level of education. So there are already conversations happening about how do we make these platforms more democratic? How do we make them more inclusive? And as a result of those conversations, organizations are now starting to think about, how do we design the workplace? New organizations are thinking about, the office environment. We all saw what happened during COVID. Many organizations closed down their offices. And I know there's been a rollback, to office working and because of all the sort of regression, I suppose, of DEI based on what's happening in the US, there seems to be some resentment around some of those DEI initiatives, but the most successful organizations, the ones that know what they need to do to be successful, will create and are creating environments, cultures, and working processes, ways of working that are much more inclusive. And we're starting to see it happen in everyday life. So before, I know during COVID, there were some organizations, mine included, that mandated cameras on. There was no discussion about that. But now I'm starting to see more and more forums, training, webinar, events where there's an explicit design around inclusion in that respect. So you don't have to have your cameras on. You don't have to speak if you don't want to. You can use the chat tool. You can use emojis. You can use different reactions in order to communicate. Everyone communicates differently and slowly. It's happening very slowly. Things are starting to change. But of course, when you go into a typical office in any country, you will, of course, be faced with a neurotypical environment. But it's slowly changing.
I love it. We can see the shift. It's happening.
It's happening. It's happening bit by bit, and people are they're starting to work it out. And I tell you where it's coming from, primarily. It's coming from people like me who are a certain age, middle-aged, and their children are receiving diagnosis, and they never got the diagnosis when they were growing up. So neurodivergence, it wasn't a thing in the 70s. It wasn't a thing in the 80s. But now, just now, children are being diagnosed earlier and earlier. And their parents are looking at their children and thinking, hang on, you know, they do this, I do that. So maybe I'm neurodivergent. And then they're starting to, through their children's experience, change the way that they interact with people and understand people at work. So it's a kind of an organic, holistic change.
Hmm. So seeing themselves in their children as well, and then
Yes,
seeing how that.
exactly that. That's how it happened to me. I was thinking, this comes from somewhere. And I've always felt very different, growing up. I always knew I wasn't the same as other people. I used to do things in a very different. People used to say, "Oh, you're really awkward. Why do you always do things, at school? Why do you always do things so awkwardly?" And I used to just walk around thinking, "Oh my God, I'm awkward, weird. I do things weirdly and I behave weirdly." And then my children, got this wonderful diagnosis. And people, I speak to some people and they go, "Oh, I'm really sorry." And I'm like, "No, it's not for me. It's not. I'm sorry. I'm glad." They've got that awareness, that self-awareness that I never had. And so, yeah, their diagnosis is giving me the confidence to say, yes, I am different. I am awkward, but that's good. That's fine.
Embrace it. Love it.
Exactly.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Kate. And
No, you're welcome.
yeah, and I can also see it being a strength as well, where because of this experience, and as you said, a lot of people are also empaths too. And because we talk a lot about, neurodivergent strengths, but how do we avoid turning into something tokenistic or something that is just or or superficial as well?
Yeah, this is the challenge we've got now. So we've got this whole generation, Gen Z, and to some extent the generation before, who are massive self-advocates, and that's fantastic. It's amazing. Don't get me wrong, I love it. It's so important that people advocate for themselves, because if you don't advocate for yourself, then no one else is going to do it. But you've got this sort of now backlash about the superpower thing, because for many, they don't perceive it as a superpower. There was this whole narrative around, "Oh, ADHD is a superpower. I can do a million things at once." And you got other people who are suffering, with that busy mind, because it can get very overwhelming. You put too much pressure on yourself, and therefore lots of people with ADHD have mental health difficulties, and they're on medication. So for many neurodivergent people, it's not a superpower. Yes, there are, fantastic elements, you know, hyperfocus, monotropism, the focus on one topic, deep dive, the ability to be able to focus for long periods of time on one thing, that ability to multitask, to have that busyness and to achieve lots of things in a very short space of time. But they come at a price, and that price is, the lows. It's a high and a low, and you have to be able to understand that in order to, harness those, fantastic elements. And I talk about it all the time, creativity, innovation, problem solving. You can get all those things with neurodivergence, but then you also have to be aware that you're not going to get it in a neurotypical way. So, self-advocacy is brilliant. Um, Deluding yourself. I don't know if people delude themselves. I mean, I get into arguments sometimes online because I try not to have conversations with, people who are neurodivergent themselves in a way that I would disagree with them, because everyone has the right to give themselves, the label they want to give themselves. If they feel their ADHD is a superpower, who am I to tell them it's not? I don't have the right to do that. But I don't think you can assume it's the same for everyone.
Hmm. And would the takeaway from this be that when it comes to neurodivergent strengths, that it can be a double-edged sword?
Yeah, exactly that. It's a double-edged sword. It's a good thing, but it needs to be managed. And there are highs and lows. So you get the hyper focus, but you could also get the burnout. You get the
Mhm.
monotropism, but you also get the need to be alone. I know there are many neurodivergent people who go to events, who speak at events, who participate, as delegates, and then need something like a day, at least sometimes 2 days, 3 days on their own to recover. And if you're working in a corporate environment and you have to attend a corporate event because your organization is running, for example, an all-employee meeting, does anyone really understand what impact that will have on the neurodivergent people? Do they realize they're going to need those 3 days to recover or that day to recover? Do they realize that they won't be able to have a conversation with anyone for, the next 24 hours? You have to be able to take the highs and the lows. And, I've been through this myself in my own life with my own family. So I know how hard it is. It's not easy, but yeah, there are strengths, but, you know, there are, there are considerations, should I say. I wouldn't even
Mhm.
describe it as a price to pay because then it makes it sound negative and it isn't negative. It's just, you know, an element of neurodivergence. It's part of it. It's part and parcel.
Mhm. And when it comes to that as well, so when it comes to strengths and also, as you said, the considerations are part of it as well. And part of it is the diversity of the different thinking styles. Say if you have a team and everyone has a different way of approaching things, which is wonderful. So how can a manager harness these different thinking styles and make it work?
By understanding the individuals and what they need in order to do great work, how they work, what it is that interests them. It's not an easy thing being a manager. And I do this exercise as part of my training program, which uses a template to give managers that uh, experience of thinking through the lens of neurodivergence. How do I assign my projects, tasks to my team members? How do I make sure that I'm giving them work that will excite them? How do I align the task with the individual's strengths? And these are the things you need to think about. So if someone, does enjoy deep dive, is hyper focused in the way that they carry out their tasks, then, give them something which is going to, align with that. Don't misappropriate projects or tasks based on your own assumptions. Have a conversation, talk to people about what interests them, look at what works and what hasn't worked in the past. Use your ability as a manager, and you should have that ability and that curiosity to be able to make the right decisions about, assigning tasks to the right individuals. And if it doesn't work, then experiment and try again.
Mhm. Yeah, it always comes back to curiosity and experimenting as well, which is a part of the curiosity, right? So knowing you're going to go out there, try something, have that conversation, get that information back and pivot as you go. So it's a learning process for both parties from the sounds of it.
Exactly. Exploration and experimentation. And as part of the curiosity, you're right. And it is a collaborative effort. You're not necessarily going to get everything right all the time. And the neurodivergent professionals I speak to always say they don't expect perfection. They don't expect their manager to get everything right all the time. But as long as there's a willingness to learn, there's a willingness to adapt, there's a willingness to be flexible, then yeah, they'll be happy. So it's just having that ability to be able to adapt and change and flex depending on the needs of your team and your team members. It's not an onerous thing if you're a curious person, a curious manager.
Mhm. And I really want to play on that a bit more. So say if a manager is listening to this right now, and say if you're one of the neurodivergent employees, what's one thing you really want them to know from the voice of that employee?
What would I really want the manager to know? Well, see, it just really depends on the individual. Again,
Mhm.
you know, you would be making an assumption if you were to pull just one thing out. And that's why I keep it really generic. Unless you're talking to an individual who tells you what it is they need. And if you know them, then you can't really, assume anything. You have to have that conversation. But if I were to give one piece of advice, it would just be to be open to difference, open to challenge your own bias, your own prejudice, your own, thoughts about what good looks like. What does professional look like? What does good communication look like? What does high performance look like? Often it doesn't look like neurodivergence, and the way neurodivergence can present doesn't mean it shouldn't look like that. But in the minds of many managers, they have an ideal perception of what a great employee looks like, behaves like, talks like, moves like. And that's, where the problems start usually.
Mhm. So being able to, as you said, I guess challenge your own perceptions and realize that there are so many different people out there and so many different ways that people think and do things as well. And
Yeah, and there's no wrong way of doing anything. What's
Mhm.
wrong when you think about it, when you look at people who are neurodivergent and you see, autistic people, but especially people who are, further along the spectrum and who are perhaps, very data driven, working with technology. You get a lot of neurodivergent people in technology and IT departments who don't necessarily feel comfortable speaking to people or interacting with others. But there's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to be a chatterbox who's a social butterfly in order to be
Mhm.
successful. You don't have to do that. And when I was young, much younger, and I was starting out in my career, that was the expectation. That you would flutter around like a social extrovert, having conversations here, there, making friends, making relations, influencing people. And I love the fact that people don't have to do that anymore because it was hideously painful for me. Hideously painful. I'm
I can
glad people
relate
don't
to
have
that.
to do that anymore.
Yeah, I can do, I was just saying I can relate to that as well. So yeah, I'm glad, as we talked about earlier, it's moving more towards inclusivity and having making it work for all these different people as well. And this might sound like a bit of a, I guess, naive way of asking this, but say how do you know? Because say if you're a really empathetic manager and you want to help people and support people who are neurodiverse versus how do you also know that they are performing, then they're not bringing their best foot forward and they're not performing. Like how do you know whether to support someone or whether to, I guess, let someone go in that sense as well?
Yeah. Hmm. It's a tough one. It's a really tough one because I've had conversations like that with managers where they haven't jumped to conclusions and they haven't had knee-jerk reactions and they've done the work and they've got the support, but they feel at the end of the day that it's not going to work and it doesn't align with the way that the business is going. And that's really hard because in that instance, how can you argue that it's something they should persist with? Business is tough, you know, it's really hard to think about the needs of the individual above the needs of the business. Decision makers will almost always go with the needs of the business. And I'm not saying that's right, but it's the reality. And yeah, in those instances, all I can do is continue to work with the individuals, continue to find solutions to the challenges they're experiencing, continue to provide tools to overcome those challenges and continue to educate and train and coach. And at the same time as working with it, because the onus is always, 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 always on the neurodivergent person to change. And it's so unfair. It's so unfair. You know, the organization, stakeholders, the 80%, 85% of people who are neurotypical have got to change themselves. Otherwise, we're going to keep having the same problems. You know, 70 to 80% global statistic of autistic people are unemployed over the age of 18. You know, can you imagine 70 to 80% of autistic people are not in work? What a waste of talent. And I know some of those people can't work, some of them can't, but a lot of them can. And the reason why they're not working is because they can't find companies, managers, leaders who will do the work to create an environment where they can enjoy and do great work and thrive.
Yeah. And with that as well, I think it would be really awesome to perhaps talk about your neuro nuggets on neuroinclusion. And if we were to have one thing from your neuro nugget to walk away from, what would that be?
Communication, 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 communication is key. And it doesn't have to take place in one way. Communication is a multitude of things. And I'm learning that myself every day, you know, with my son in particular, who doesn't enjoy talking anymore. He used to be a real chatterbox when he was little, but he now communicates in other ways with his eyes and, you know, points and things like that. And for now, that's something that is okay because, you know, it's what works for him and helps him to be regulated. So the one thing I would take from the advice I give in my videos is to communicate in a democratic way and allow for others to communicate in a way that works for them.
Mhm. Could you go into a bit more detail about what you mean by democratic?
What I mean by democratic is not taking a specific, rigid approach to communication. Communication is social interaction, behaviors, verbal communication, body movements, nonverbal communication. It's a range of different things that enables people to put across what they're thinking and feeling. And it's everyone's right to communicate. And if you say you can only communicate in this very rigid, specific way, then how is that democratic? It has to be a given that everyone has the opportunity to interact, to communicate, to put across how they're thinking and feeling in a way that suits them.
Hmm. And as we come back to being able to help the person in front of the individual person or support them in front of you and connect with them on an individual basis, there's this book called Coach the Person, Not the Problem. And it kind of reminds me of this.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Everyone's so unique. You can't, and of course, there are commonalities, there are themes, there are, you know, generic similarities from one person to the next, but everyone is different. And the only way you can understand what that individual needs is by having a conversation with that individual to understand them better. The problems always start when people assume they don't want to have the conversation, they feel it's uncomfortable, they feel it's awkward, and they'd rather jump to conclusions and pretend. And that's, yeah, always a mistake.
Mhm. Definitely. Curiosity and experimentation and understanding the unfamiliar. That is definitely what I'm taking away from this, among other amazing things today. And with that, Beth, thank you so much. It's been incredible, valuable today as well. And for anyone listening, if this resonated with you, check out Kate's New Nuggets on the Caboose app. And if you're watching this later, feel free to drop your reflections in the comments or any questions as well. And thank you so much, Kate, today for being here. And hopefully
Thank
we'll see you
you.
again next time.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you
you.
so much.
Amazing. And are there any last things you want to shout out or talk about before we end today?
No, I mean, people can find me if they're looking for me. I'm always on LinkedIn. I post a lot and tell stories about neurodivergence and neuroinclusion on LinkedIn. So you can connect with me there at Kate Isichei, or you can visit my website, which is wheretolookcoms.co.uk to find out more about my coaching and training.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kate. And have a good one, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.